Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Before I start with today's true crime case, I just want to talk about the fact that I've got a book being released in September this year. So The Serial Killer Next Door will be available in all good bookshops, also on Amazon. You can follow the links below if you want to pre-order it. The reason I'm talking about it is I would never have done it without you asking me to. You constantly get in contact with me about books, and when Little Brown offered me the opportunity, I decided, why not? So finally, it will be out in September. I'll also be doing the Audible version. I will be recording it. So if you like listening to my voice, well, maybe you can wait till that particular option becomes available. If you don't really like my voice, then I just suggest getting the book itself. Also, I'm on tour in the UK with my Killer Cults tour. I'm also still doing the Serial Killer Next Door tour, and there's going to be a new one announced soon. So if you want to get some tickets, make sure that you look in your local area, because I'm pretty much going everywhere. I've kind of got to really know the UK. I'd love to go out to America and do it as well. That's a whole nother story though. It's a whole nother story about a tour promoter literally coming, videoing my show, and then basically stealing it. But hey, let's not get too salty on that. Doesn't matter, move on. Life's too short, right? Also, I wanted to advertise my amazing new merch. I love this. I can't tell you how much I love this. The looks that you get in Tesco are brilliant. It's just like, you're doing your shop and people are just either completely aware and are like, yeah, I absolutely connect with that. Or alternatively, they're like, should I feel offended? I don't know, because that's a really cute cat. Also, I loved a story about one of our viewers who's bought this, and unfortunately, one of their cats at the rescue has been murdered. So she's wearing that to let whoever that perpetrator is know, don't with cats. Simple as. Right guys, let's get on with today's true crime case. So today's case is one that really disturbs me, and it disturbs me mainly because I am a mother. My babies are everything. They made me far better than I ever was. They certainly made me better than I ever believed I could be. They are my breath, they are my foundation, they are everything. My hope, my joy, my fear, everything. So when I look at them, they're extensions of who I am. And even though they are completely unique individuals with their own mindset, their own dreams, etc., because I created them, I feel this sense of ownership in the loosest of terms, but nonetheless ownership, because I feel that they and I are connected indelibly. The idea that they could ever hurt me or harm me in any way, shape or form, aside from by accident, i.e. if they get hurt, and that's obviously terrifying for me, or if they had something awful happen, of course that will hurt me. But for the most part, they would never voluntarily, in my mindset at least, do anything that could cause me deep pain. And certainly they've never even slammed a door in this house. And I'm not lying. I'm genuinely not lying. Polygraph me. The point is, I genuinely have one of those connections with my children that I think so many of us have. It's that absolute love, unconditioned, a sense of acceptance, sense of mutual consideration and respect. And those boundaries being breached, well, it's almost inconceivable to me that that would happen. So today's case is really one of those that provokes so many reactions and feelings, because Margaret, the mother in this situation, the mother of our perpetrator, is just an all-round good human being. Margaret Sumny is somebody who is so devoted to her family. And yet here we are, in spite of that, discussing her demise. So let's look at our victim in this case, Margaret Shade. Obviously, she becomes Sumny when she gets married, but initially she's born Margaret Shade. She was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She was the youngest child. She had 3 sisters and 1 brother. And I would say they're a lovely, connected family, genuinely, because the stuff that they do together just demonstrates that they obviously got on incredibly well. So Margaret Shade and her family, they often danced and they put on dance recitals, and Margaret, firstly, was stunning. And that's kind of helpful when you're front-facing as a dancer, isn't it? When you look great. But she was also an unbelievably talented dancer. She was a great teacher of dance, so she was an incredible inspiration to people around her. She was incredibly motivating. And because she is obviously schooled in her trade, she's also somebody that carried a great deal of respect. And she's so committed and connected to dancing that she goes on to own her own dance studio. So everything about her life is performance. And like I said, when you see a picture of her, you'll note how beautiful she is, but also how she's very aware of her own appearance. She looks after herself. She's not a dinted tin like me. I look like I fell out of the car every single morning. Somebody like Margaret, they just have that finesse about them. They have that je ne sais quoi quality, the X factor, I suppose. And Margaret's sister said that she had just an incredible personality. She was one of those individuals who could teach young people how to dance, and that's no easy feat. We all know that children, I don't know, don't listen all the time. And also, they tend to just go off in different directions. They're a little bit like trying to keep a bag of cats together. You know, they're all off in every direction and it's quite hard to keep them focused, but she obviously had a real tenacity and capability to do this. Now, during her first marriage, Margaret has 2 children. She has Peggy and Ellen, equally as beautiful as their mother. Genuinely the all-American family. I mean that just most respectfully. The fact is, you look at them and you're like, who wouldn't want to be them? The smiling pictures, the beautiful smiles, the clear connection as a family, it just resonates. And Ellen described her mother as the perfect mother, caring, unconditionally loving. Now, as is the case in lots of marriages, it sadly doesn't work out for Margaret and her actual husband at the time. So she ends up getting divorced, and this would clearly be quite painful for the children. We understand that psychologically divorce is something that's relatively challenging, but nonetheless, young people also understand that it's better to be in happy relationships. And Margaret ends the relationship with her father and then meets David Sumny Sr., who's really successful. So she meets somebody who's a peer, because she is also a successful human being. She meets somebody who's obviously got means materialistically, which is always helpful. So after she meets David Sumny Sr., they actually get married and he becomes stepfather to Margaret's 2 children. And we know that when it comes down to stepfamilies, I'm a stepfamily myself in my own life, we appreciate it's more complex. The landscape can be more challenging because you have different parents with different styles. You have co-parents who come in because they're partners of your parents and so on and so forth. And it can often mean that marriages break down relatively quickly. But it seems, at least for the early years, that's not how this plays out, because David Sumny Sr. is somebody who's really devoted to his family. He graduated Harvard, so we're talking a really high level achiever. He was a doctor, so very clever. And Margaret's sisters described him as a really nice man. Apparently he's quite a sharp suit dresser, always had the best suits and watches. And he was said to be really loving, very giving, very kind. And ultimately, I think when we talk about the psychology of individuals who are very relatable, very empathic, very compassionate, very loving, even though they are absolute traits that we would all wish to share our space with, everybody wants to know people with those traits, they're also the traits that get exploited. They're also the traits that mean that you're more vulnerable, because predators or people with predatory natures, people who wish to exploit fractures, they see those good qualities and they know how to manipulate people. And that isn't for 1 minute to be disrespectful towards people who find themselves in these situations. People who are manipulative, they take the very best aspects of other people's natures and they use them to gain for themselves by exploiting what they consider weakness. We see it as a strength, but certainly it seems as if both Margaret and David Sumny Sr. have these genuinely embracing and compassionate traits. And like I said, in the right space and place, that's amazing. But when the wrong person is around you, that can cause issues and create a level of vulnerability. Margaret was described by everybody as being really giving, very loving, very kind. And like I said, you take a look at the pictures and she's just perfectly coiffed, isn't she? Her hair's perfect, her makeup's always done. Anybody watching my channel knows that on occasion, I will try and make an effort. But most of the time, I might look like I've just wandered in, confused off the street, having borrowed somebody else's clothes. Genuinely, that is more real than I can express. But you wouldn't find Margaret in that way. She's absolutely articulate in every shape and form. We get to April 1989 and Margaret and David Sr. have a really happy event. She gives birth to a little baby boy, and he's named David Jr. after his father. So when David Jr. is born, David Sr. is absolutely elated. He's so happy because he's got a son, and it's his biological boy. So even though he's been an amazing stepfather and he loves his stepdaughters, the point is now he's got something that connects him by blood to all of them. It's that way of synchronizing who they are as a family, because there is this common connector in David Jr. And Peggy and Ellen, who are of course the doting big sisters, they looked after David as if he were their own. And again, I have got 2 older boys who do that with their baby sister. It is just so joyful to see the people that you've cultivated. Because when you see people that you've cultivated around vulnerable children or animals, for example, and they're just so loving, you're like, it's going to be okay. They've got the tools they need. So Peggy and Ellen are very much like this. And that age gap meant that they could treat him more like a baby of their own versus being a little sibling. So they were fussing with him, and there's lots of video clips of them in the pool with him and just having a really good time. And he's beautiful to look at as well. And everybody made a fuss over David. Those family videos demonstrate that he was the centre of the attention. And I would say that Margaret suffered from the same symptom that I always talk about my father suffering from, which is she applauded David crossing the road. Anything he did was a big deal. So he, from a very early age, is the centre of their world. He's videoed in situations where you can see everyone is paying attention to him. He is somebody who, from an early get-go situation, recognises that he's a big deal. Now, I am not in any way, shape or form suggesting that's a bad thing. I think that it's really helpful for secure attachment, and psychologically we have evidence that it is very important for secure attachment that children do get made a fuss over and that they are made to feel special. Equally, however, if you are an individual with narcissistic tendencies, if you have a fracture in your foundation, shall we say on a predisposed level, you're born that way, then this kind of attention can unfortunately work badly for you, because you already have that desire to be the most important person in the room, to feel superior, etc. And then when people actually give in to that by consistently reinforcing you, even for doing the smallest of things, well, that amplifies that already problem trait that exists within you. So anything he does, he's congratulated over. And David Sr. just really went to town on making a fuss of David Jr. He basically, according to the family, wanted him to be treated like a prince. He wanted him to get anything he wanted, so he was ultimately spoiled. And also David Sr. really liked to brag about his son. So he's somebody who likes to go out and basically talk about how great David Jr. is. And again, is that a bad thing? No. I mean, there's a limit. We've all met those people, haven't we, who are parents, and you're like just trying to navigate whether your child is ever going to get to a point where they can get the spoon in their mouth without not only smearing it all over their head, but also somehow getting it on your walls, occasionally on other people who are just passing. And you're thinking one day this is going to happen. And then the parent next to you is like, oh yeah, she's 3. She speaks 3 languages, and last week Mensa asked her in for a special chat because they think she's probably just a prodigy genius of some sort. You know, no one wants that parent. But I do appreciate that when you are bringing up a child, often everything they do seems miraculous because you adore them so deeply. So this is likely why David Sr. is going out and talking this way. And Margaret's sister did say, you know, David Sr. absolutely adored David Jr. a whole lot. And of course, Margaret did too. So from a really early age, we can say that David, because he's also bright, learns to navigate his environment to get what he wants. So he realizes that these people want to do his bidding. Also, they have access to nice things. They're not financially in a problem situation. And that means essentially that if he wants something, it isn't beyond achieving it. So from early on, he's genuinely learning his trade at manipulation. And as early as 2nd grade, he was one of those young people who was wanting and expecting money. And that does speak of a level of entitlement, but equally, we could say, well, if you're always being given what you want, of course you're going to feel entitled. That isn't your fault. You're not the problem there. It's the parents who are giving you everything. And for many children, even if they were given everything they ever wanted, that wouldn't make them narcissistic. It wouldn't make them nasty. Spoiling children doesn't ruin them, even though the title spoiled would suggest it does. Actually, many children just feel cherished, because if you haven't got the personality fractures and characteristics that will make you, shall we say, superior, arrogant, narcissistic, etc., you're likely just going to feel like you were really loved. So he is somebody being totally treated on a daily basis, and he's starting to get quick to recognise just what he needs to do to up the ante and receive more. There are some traits as well that we see when he's young, which are deeply worrying. So David's sister Ellen, she actually recorded an incident where her mother was basically hysterical. She was screaming because David Jr. had literally killed a bird with his hands. Now, when you look at the McDonald triad, I appreciate that the McDonald triad has got some critics. I actually am really on board with the McDonald triad. But nonetheless, look at the McDonald triad, you see animal torture and murder as one of the key points. It is deeply unusual and highly disturbing for a child to kill animals. It worries me, therapeutically, even when children are killing things as small as spiders, because I have unfortunately had to bear witness to graduation of those experiences onto bigger creatures and then mammals and onwards and upwards. And so essentially when we see this kind of behaviour, we would expect some kind of reaction. We do know that children sometimes by mistake kill animals. I've seen this in my career with children who held gerbils too tight, even a kitten that was actually killed by a client when she was very young, and that was something that really played on her mind for many years. But this is accidental and this is conscience-based. There is a reaction, a horror, an understanding that they've done something that's quite terrible. They've taken a life. But that's not how David Jr. acts. He's killed this bird with his hands. His mother's seen this and he shows no emotion. He shows no remorse at all. So again, that's out of context with what we would expect, because if the child is trying to cuddle it too tightly and then there is hysteria around that child because a bird has died, one expects that the child is equally going to suddenly recognise the gravity and start getting upset. Not where David Jr. is concerned. And again, when we're looking at future predictors of violent behaviour, animal torture and murder is certainly a big red flag. So there's certainly some, shall we say, challenging behaviours and actions where David Jr. is concerned. And this is before he's 8 years of age. So we're talking really early childhood at this point. And if we're looking at indicators of future problem behaviour, well, certainly David Jr. has them. When he gets to 8, a big deal happens in his family because his parents' marriage starts to break down. Apparently Margaret and David Sr. weren't communicating very well. They often went about their business separately, so they kind of getting on with their lives in isolation from one another. And understandably, no child wants their parents to split up, even children in situations that are really difficult, because it's a stereotype, it's the expectation, it's what you're used to. Familiarity, even when it's uncomfortable, can sometimes feel less scary than the unfamiliar. So we absolutely accept that he'll be going through a level of grief, seeing that his parents are not necessarily as compatible as he had believed they were. And then in 2001, Margaret and David Sr. ultimately decide to split, and it is not a happy divorce. So during the divorce itself, David Jr. is basically pulled between the two of them, which is not a good thing for any child. It is the adult's job in these circumstances and scenarios to co-parent. It's not about winning. It's about doing what's right for your child. Now, I know that they were both absolutely devoted to this boy. We cannot say anything negative about them in that way. But as parents, your child is not to be weaponized, because what happens is the child then can create some very symptomatic behaviors as a way of managing their experience. Often their behavior will become really problematic. Sometimes they'll get involved in things like self-harm, because what they're trying to do is to try to deflect the behavior between the parents by making it be concentrated on them. So understandably, this is not a positive scenario where David Jr. is concerned. And when it comes down to divorce, it's what every parent needs to realise. It's not about your needs, it's everything to do with the child's needs. And I'm not trying to be negative to David Sr. or Margaret. It's painful. What I'm saying is when there are children involved, there's collateral damage. And if we have issues that already fundamentally lie within their nature, what we don't want to do is exacerbate and amplify them further. And in this case, that could have done that. Now, following his parents' divorce, indeed, as I just mentioned, when it comes down to symptomatic behaviours and changes in behaviour of children, indeed, David Jr. does become increasingly violent. He'd lash out at his family. And we could say, well, that's down to the divorce, or we could say those fractures I'm talking about are being exacerbated. And bear in mind as well, if you happen to have narcissistic traits, you will be somebody who needs the attention on you. You will also be somebody who wants everything to be about you. You'll want your needs met immediately. When people are getting divorced, their eye goes off the ball because they're dealing with a whole heap of problematic scenarios such as financial issues, issues with the ex, dealing with court, extensive issues with lawyers that are just fleecing you for your cash, etc. So you are not necessarily as connected on the ball with looking after your children as you would have been before. And it's temporary and it's understandable. But if you happen to be a child with these tendencies, then man, you're not going to want them to take the eye off that ball if that ball is you. So the increasingly violent behaviour is probably also to do with the fact that it gives him instant attention. It gratifies him because people are noticing him. And also he wants to punish people for not being fully present where he is concerned. Now, the divorce devastates Margaret financially. She's actually forced to close down her dance studio, which must have been absolutely heartbreaking. She ended up getting a full-time job at Saks because she just needed the regular income. So we can tell from that scenario that there was obviously some real problems in the divorce, and she didn't necessarily get the remuneration that she would have ideally wished to have had, which is a real shame because to lose her life's work and to have to close down a studio must have just been heartbreaking, incredibly stressful. And also having to actually go and work for somebody else is going to be a big change because you've been your own boss and suddenly you're having to be somebody beholden to others. All of those would have increased the stress levels in the home. In 2008, in spite of all of this, because obviously David has a father who's quite wealthy, he ends up going to college. He goes to study maths at George Washington University in DC. His dad paid for the college. He even had an apartment that he paid for. And this is good because at the end of the day, if you're a man of means and you can bring your child up educationally in such a way, then that's a privilege and opportunity that every parent would wish to have. And this should be where the story flourishes into a man doing well at university, particularly because he's somebody who can get in there to study maths, which is difficult, and he should then go on to live a pro-social happy life. But of course, it's never going to be that simple, is it? Because we wouldn't be talking about it today if that had been the outcome. So to all intents and purposes, this young man is being given every opportunity, every possibility. And Margaret had such high hopes for David. You know, she wants him to be very accomplished. She wants him to go far. She's been successful. Yes, things have gone wrong with her dance school because of the divorce, but she was somebody who's really inspirational. And she clearly believes that David can achieve whatever he dreams of. Now, in 2010, Margaret actually goes to visit David in Washington. And she ends up on a phone call with her daughter, Ellen. And it's a really odd phone call because she basically says that both she and David are in hospital. So she tells a story that during this visit in a hotel room, David Jr. gets a knife and just starts slashing his arms. And then apparently Margaret falls down, hits her head. So then they both end up in hospital. Now, Ellen said that that story did not make sense to her. She really had a feeling from the get-go that her mother was covering something up, and it makes sense, doesn't it? Because I appreciate it's awful if David Jr. is self-harming. Self-harm is something that we see play out with people who are psychologically struggling. It's a defense mechanism on one level. You want to survive, but you're dealing with really unmanageable feelings, and so you make it physical for a moment because maybe it will just give you a little bit of time to deflect from the agony internally. So we understand how challenging it is to actually have to manage such a condition. But even in that scenario, say your child is cutting themselves, and that's going to be harrowing for you, and you're just going to want to wrap them up and make them better. How do you end up falling over and hitting your head? Because ultimately in that scenario, you are going to be the one in control, comforting the child. To me, that sounds far more like he's actually being violent towards his mother. Maybe she has been trying to stop him harming himself and he's pushed her back, and that's ultimately how she's ended up hurting herself. But it doesn't make sense that they're in a scenario where he's just cut himself and then she has just found herself injured by mistake because she's fell over. It just doesn't add up. And this also gives us, I suppose, an insight that maybe David Jr. has got some other struggles going on beneath the surface. Now, despite this erratic behaviour, and despite the fact that for many young people it might mean some time out from education because they need to gather their thoughts, maybe have some therapy and figure out what's going on beneath the surface, his parents just carry on funding his college education. But David Sr. then discovers that David isn't actually attending his classes, which is, I don't know, a little bit of an issue when you're actually studying. Kind of one of the things that goes without saying is that you'll actually be present. So anyway, David gets kicked out of college. So this means he's then forced to move back home to Pittsburgh. And it's at this point that he splits his time between staying with his mum and his dad. So clearly, both of his parents are very open to the relationship with their son. And in spite of his challenging behaviour, they clearly are devoted to him. They clearly love him. So David has now lost his university place, obviously will be drifting a little bit. And he stays with mum and stays with dad and moves between those homes. And then when he's 24, so still a relatively young man, he starts really engaging with the gym. He's working out, he's lifting weights. He's a good looking guy. He's got this great background. He's got this loving family. He is the ideal that so many of us would wish to experience. Somebody who's got it all and has a future full of potential. But it's as if David Jr. just doesn't really see any of that. It's as if David Jr. believes that he deserves more just for existing. It's also at this point he tells his mother that he's joined the Navy SEALs. And of course, for Margaret, this would be absolutely incredible because the Navy SEALs are awesome, aren't they? They are incredible human beings and they are physically incredible. And it's also the temperament and the teamwork that's a big part of the SEAL experience. So she hopes this is going to mean that David's found his way, and she's really proud of David, as any mother would be if that was their intention and they succeeded in achieving it. But things don't remain, shall we say, in such a positive direction. Because in June 2014, David Jr. gets arrested for harassment. Then, in August 2014, David Jr. is charged with assaulting Margaret. So she's dealing now with violence from her son. And I think we often think about domestically violent situations being a male partner towards a female partner, but we forget that children do domestically abuse their parents. And Margaret's tiny, and this guy's big. So the damage that he can do to her is huge. So he's now got these issues around harassment, also around assault, but it feels as if Margaret doesn't want to take it too seriously, and I get that. But I think that so many of us can relate to Margaret not really taking these situations as seriously as she should have. When somebody physically assaults you and you love them, you always want to believe the best in them. Now, if it's a partner, it's challenging enough, particularly if you've got a background with that partner where your life's been positive with them, and then boom, out of the blue, they attack you. Often you'll think something is going on for them that has made them snap. Or maybe I did something really bad that's deserving of this, because you want to contextualize what your history of your relationship has been like with this incident that's occurred. And this is why people often stay after that first attack, because you think, well, they've always been amazing until now. It's an even more challenging layer when it's your child abusing you, because you grew them, you love them unconditionally on the whole. They're the people that you have believed the best in. And when they harm you, you want to put it down to bad behavior. You don't want to see them as a predator. You don't want to see them as a danger. You want to see them as somebody who has lost control, like the naughty teenager, even when they're an adult. Because to you, they're always a baby. They're always your child. And that means that you minimize the harm that they can do to you. And we see this play out where parents are killed by their children, because ultimately they cannot conceive that something they could have created could lead to such horrific actions. So I think that she's probably minimizing at this point. Now, in July 2015, Margaret calls Ellen. She's really upset. So David Jr. had been at his dad's house, and When I say he had beat his father, I am talking about his father is lucky he survived. His father had been beaten up so badly, there was actually so much yelling, so much shouting, that the neighbours eventually called the police, which is great because how often do we cover things on this channel where people don't ring the police, but clearly in that neighbourhood, people were thinking something terrible is unfolding, and they were right. So when the police arrive, they have to force the door open, and David Jr. is standing over his dad. His dad is covered in blood. Now, allegedly, the reason it had escalated to this point is because David Jr. wanted a vacation and his dad wouldn't pay for it. So the result of his father just saying, no, you know what? I paid for all that education that you just threw away. I'm not going to pay for a vacation for you because, to be fair, you don't deserve a holiday, do you? Because with respect, why would an adult ask a parent to pay for their holiday? It speaks of an emotional immaturity, but also, like I said, that thread of narcissism is there, isn't it? This entitlement, this grandiosity, this idea that somehow, just because he's asked for it, he should receive. And yes, we can say, well, on a reflection basis, his childhood was very much like that. Yeah, but there are enough people around us that we see on a day-to-day basis that don't have that kind of lifestyle that make us realise that we were just lucky in our childhood. We don't expect that to carry on ad infinitum unless we do have that very egocentric, emotionally immature and potentially unstable core that David Jr. may well have. So when he's told no, this enrages David Jr. And bear in mind, he's a big guy, he's a strong guy, he works out. So then he pins his dad, David Sr., against the front door and just beats him. And the injuries were horrific. So David Sr. had a brain bleed, he had really bad groin injuries, he had spinal injuries, and these injuries were so awful that David Sr. could no longer live on his own. He lost his independence. And I would say that when he moves to the nursing home, it won't just be about being looked after by other people, which is certainly something that he deserved. It would be that his whole experience of safety has crumbled. If you can be almost killed in your own home by somebody that you have given everything, your world just dissolves into a space of not knowing. How could you possibly conceive that this could occur? And then there you are, covered in blood, brutally damaged, experiencing a brain bleed because the person you gave everything says it's not enough. So I imagine the move to the nursing home is also about trying to make sure that he is safe and that he's protected from what's occurred in his own home. Now, it goes without saying at this point, David is arrested for assaulting his father. He's charged with aggravated assault, public drunkenness, disorderly conduct, and harassment. He was then taken to jail, where he should have been left, and he basically calls a friend who he asks to bail him out. So even though he's done this, he clearly doesn't feel that he should be behind bars. I don't know about you. Maybe it's because I don't have that criminal mind as far as being able to be somebody with that kind of intent, that kind of malevolence. So I can't understand how it would be to be an individual who's quite nasty or narcissistic or somebody who just has psychopathic tendencies, for example. I can't imagine what it would be like really to be somebody who finds myself in jail after doing what I've just described happened to David Sr. As a human being, I would hope that if I was in a situation like that, there would be a sober moment where I think to myself, I deserve this. I'm not necessarily thinking that I'd be ringing people to bail me out because I don't know whether in the cool light of day I would be thinking that that was something that meant I took accountability and responsibility for what had happened. I genuinely think that he doesn't care about his actions. He just cares about getting what he wants. Now, understandably, for Margaret, this is a real wake-up call. It's not a big enough wake-up call because we wouldn't be telling this story if it had been, but she gets the reality that this is something she needs to take seriously. She gets the check that she needs, which is that David is dangerous. He's assaulted his dad. So now she's really scared of him. But Margaret is a loving, devoted parent. Imagine that duality. Imagine being in a psychological circumstance where you love this child with all of your being and this child scares you and you are scared of what they might do to you. How do you create a bridge? How do you allow yourself to keep yourself safe whilst equally protecting your child? And often what you'll do is you'll say, I'm really scared, this person's got potential to harm me, but I love them enough. I'm going to shelve the fear, I'm going to shelve the intuition, I'm going to shelve the reality of what I know, and I'm just going to think maybe I can love them better. Maybe they can grow out of this, because even as a 20-something-year-old, you're still believing this person can potentially change. But David Jr. isn't going to. It's not within his makeup or psyche to do. On the 20th of November 2016, Margaret actually calls 911. At this point, she asked for the police to come to her residence. She'd been beaten up, and there was a domestic taking place at the point that the police arrived. And when they find her, she's really badly injured. She's got bruised ribs, possibly broken ribs, which are agonizing for anybody out there who's experienced it. They are agonizing to endure. You can't breathe hardly because of the pain. During the assault, David Jr. had actually picked up Margaret out of bed and squeezed her really hard. And he said, this is how the Navy SEALs do it. Ultimately, just think about the intimacy of that action. You're picking this petite woman out of bed, this person who's protected you and looked after you all your life, and you are wrapping your arms around them and you are squeezing so hard that you are literally breaking her ribs. The actual close proximity of that action, that speaks of something so devastating, doesn't it? Because if you think about the action, usually that's a place of pleasure, a place of safety, where somebody wraps their arms around us that's close to us and makes us feel loved. Yet in this moment, it's murderous as far as its intent. Police then search the house because David isn't present initially, and they find him just really intoxicated in his bedroom. And Margaret actually had some handwritten notes that she'd made, and she handed those over to the police. She actually wrote, "He tried to kill me, punched my face, my body, choked me, pulled my hand across my body, and he told me, 'I'll get you next time.'" So he's literally telling her there's going to be a next time. And she knows that ultimately he was serious about trying to kill her. So this man is an absolute danger, and not just to women, but to men, because we've seen the way that he has been to his own father, and actually to anyone, because if you can do this to the people that have loved you, well, they mean nothing to you. That means no one means anything to you. The fact that she's writing those things down is heartbreaking, isn't it? It's almost prophetic. She's recording this information, and this information is going to be vital evidence down the line. So David Jr. is arrested for that assault on his mother. Initially, he is charged with assault, but then Margaret requests to have it reduced to harassment. She asks for leniency with David. She doesn't want him to go to prison, ideally. She doesn't want him to have a terrible punishment. She doesn't want to be the person who is essentially love's executioner. She doesn't believe that he's truly capable of doing the things that she's written, even though we all know that that indicates a character that is incredibly dangerous. She's still believing the best in him. During that hearing as well, it's found that David had lied and he wasn't a Navy SEAL. He was never in the military at all, which is unsurprising, because let me tell you, training for the Navy SEALs isn't just I want to join the Navy SEAls. Okay, we'll take you. You know, that's not going to be the way it works. The initial training takes a year. It includes underwater demolition, a parachute jump. Then there's another 18 months of specialized training and pre-deployment training to survive combat missions, because the Navy want people to have physical fitness that's at its peak. They want them to have amazing skills. They want them to be able to work in a team. And he's done none of that. So of course he wasn't in the Navy SEALs. Of course that was another guise to act like he was doing something acceptable and to just pull the wool over his mother's eyes. Some people could argue maybe that's a real delusion. Maybe he genuinely believes that he is doing that because his psychology is fractured. I would argue no. I would argue he's a con artist, he's an exploiter, he's a predator. It's as simple as that. He's exploiting his mother's good nature by lying to her about what he's doing with his life and where he's going in his future. It's just a way of getting more out of her. So after assaulting his mother, David Jr. is resentenced for the assault of his father, and he does actually get sent to Washington County Jail for 8 to 16 months. And Margaret, as the dutiful, loving mother, she actually went to visit her son in jail at every given opportunity. It breaks my heart. It really breaks my heart to think about that, because the unconditional love, the absolute loyalty she shows David Jr. is something he just doesn't deserve. He doesn't deserve it. He's all but killed his father, and he's attempted essentially to kill her. And yet here she is, pleading for him to have a lenient sentence, visiting him at every given moment, and it's all going to be for nothing. If anything, all this will do is demonstrate that somebody who is beautiful and compassionate and full of love can give birth to a monster. That's the truth. That somebody who has in her life cultivated all that is good, all that is positive, all that is loving, can be destroyed by the very traits that make her beautiful. Her absolute devotion to her children. Whilst David Jr. is in prison, he actually tells a social worker that he's really struggling with alcoholism. He said, listen, this is the reason why I've assaulted my mother and father. And he says that jail wasn't helping him. So at this point, he's actually sent to a rehabilitation centre in Pennsylvania. And I think we'd all agree that's a great move. Somebody who's a little bit more, shall we say, suspicious of the situation could just believe that maybe the reason he wanted to go to rehab was he thought it would be easier than being in jail. But I think it's really positive when an offender can acknowledge that they have an issue with dependency. And of course, if their time served can be done in such a way that they're not going to repeat offences because they come off the drugs that they're addicted to, then all power to that situation. Also, I guess if you're in the prison and you're working with him as a social worker and he's basically saying, this is why I offended, I hurt my mother and father because I was under the influence, then that means he's going to be less dangerous coming out. So he goes to this rehabilitation centre, and when he's released from rehab early, because obviously he hasn't had access to his drugs, he ends up moving into a halfway house. They help him get a job. He starts working for a glass manufacturing company. And at this point, Margaret is just breathing in the hopeful possibilities. She's thinking, maybe this was the change that he needed. Maybe even though he had to go to prison, and I feel guilty for that, which undoubtedly she would have, she could start to think, well, even though all of this has happened, it's happened for a good reason. David Jr. is going to get his life together. He's going to move forward. We can put this in the past, and he will be a better human being for the experience. But of course, these things never work quite as linear and hopefully as we would wish for them to do. On August the 2nd, 2018, David Sr. dies at the age of 74 in the nursing home. And one of the reasons for that is all those injuries that contributed towards him ending up there. So David Jr. is certainly culpable, I believe, for his father's death. Yes, it's happened after the initial event of him being beaten up, but nonetheless, the injuries were severe and traumatic. Now, not long after his father's death, David Jr. meets a woman on a dating app. Apparently, initially, he seems like a gentleman. He's very attractive. He's got good manners. He's well-spoken. Well, of course, because he's somebody who's good at conning people. He's somebody who's been given a very nice lifestyle. He's an individual who will have had the trappings of good education. So you can wear that mask very effectively for a period of time. She said that he always seemed like he had the right words, that he was really in touch with his emotions, but he had this very masculine energy, which is just the perfect mix, isn't it? We're talking the ideal metrosexual there, somebody who can be a new man, but with the old man energy as well. So we've got this protector and yet this person who's sensitive. It's the textbook modern guy that every girl is essentially hoping exists. But of course, that doesn't last for very long. A few months into his relationship, David suffers this basketball injury, and that basketball injury stops him from training. So now he's recuperating and he's struggling because he's not got the deflection of exercise as he would normally have. Also, the likelihood is he's going to be given some kind of medication. And we all know that if you have had dependency issues, any kind of medications can send you back into a spiral and cycle of dependency. And it seems at this point he also starts wanting to interfere with his mother's financial affairs. Now, we already know that he's somebody who's been very domestically abusive towards her. This now speaks of coercion, doesn't it? Trying to take over her financial affairs. There's something very sinister about that. And his ex-girlfriend actually said that when David Jr. spoke about his mother, he would tell this story as if she was dealing with really severe forgetfulness, maybe dementia. He was bringing it into sharp focus that apparently his mother was having problems with aging. And he was acting at that moment in time as if he was doing her a favour. He was just trying to help her. But we all appreciate from the character that I've discussed and described so far, that wouldn't be the motivation. The motivation will be, if I can control your financial affairs, I can spend your money. Now, by February 2019, David's girlfriend is being treated in a very similar fashion to the way his mother has been treated. So she's starting to deal with the extremely controlling behaviour that we have been covering so far. He becomes very demanding. He's getting very aggressive with her. Basically, he's jealous of everybody, wants all her attention. And she has the good sense to think, this isn't the guy who I was sold. This isn't that kind, sensitive, modern guy with a protective twist. This is just a predator. This is a man who is not kind, not compassionate, but also he's deeply controlling. But David refuses to accept it, constantly contacts her, and eventually the way to kind of manage his behaviour is she says, look, we can be friends. I want it to be a platonic friendship, but I don't want to have a physical relationship with you. And apparently that just made him seem calmer. He appeared in a better mental health space. So she's given him some of what he wants, not all of what he wants, but to some degree he's got a level of control back in the fact that he can still have some kind of relationship with her. So she manages that in an effective way, because it could have turned nasty, but essentially by breaking up with him and giving herself the all-important space between them, but by not totally breaking it off, as in, if I see you, I'll be friendly, of course we can still talk to each other, that's given him enough control still in his mind that he hasn't lost it completely. We get to July 2019 and David has now got a new girlfriend, and they go off on this 5-day beach vacation to Atlantic City, New Jersey. And she said the reason that she went with him was she wanted to figure out whether their relationship was going to work. There is that old saying, isn't it, that if you go on holiday together, it's a make or break situation. You think you like the person, then you go and spend 2 weeks with them in Alicante, and after day 3 you think, I don't want to be here anymore. I'm wondering whether there's going to be some all-inclusive somewhere I can just escape to. But you just inevitably put up with it till the end of the holiday with these really awkward photographs of you both, where you are carrying the knowledge that you never want to see them again. And also realising that some of their habits are really grotesque and you'd actually kiss them, which is disturbing at every level at this point. Just throwing it out there. That's the kind of thing that happens, isn't it? So I get that completely. Trying to check whether their relationship's going to go the distance, and it doesn't. Because what can we say? The trip turns ugly. Things go sour real quick. So first of all, he physically abuses her, he hits her, and he actually tortured her for 3 days in the hotel room. She said that he strangled her, that he waterboarded her. He said that she was choked until she passed out. She was punched in the face. She was attacked in every area of the hotel room and the bathroom of that hotel room. He'd say, how do you want your body to be found? In the bathroom from an overdose? Or would you just let your body to disappear? Which is horrifying. And also, it speaks of real grave potential, because he has thought about, firstly, how to torture her. Let's be honest. I mean, it's not like most of us are going out there thinking, well, how shall I deal with my relationship? I'll just waterboard them. I mean, I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not actually entirely sure what waterboarding is, because I've seen it featured in different ways in different situations. But what I do know is it's incredibly challenging for somebody to experience it. It's horrible. It makes you feel like you're going to drown, etc. You're always constantly trying to catch your breath. And essentially somebody has complete power and domination over you during that experience. That's why they use it in torture, to get information out of people when they're being investigated and so on and so forth. So he has planned and premeditated this, and also it feels like he's very much playing that role that he's been lying about, the idea of being this Navy SEAL, this military guy who's got this experience and got this education and knows what to do in these circumstances. But this is an innocent young woman we're dealing with. And he's playing out his violent fantasies in this way. Just as he murdered that bird when he was a little boy, just as he's beaten up his father to a point where he went into care and then died, just as he's really badly attacked his mother, now it's his girlfriend's turn. And he is not just torturing her physically, he's torturing her mentally, making you think this guy's actually premeditated what he's going to do and how he's going to kill you and what he's going to do with your body. You can't have it more real than that. And she said that she was basically saved by a bellhop who found her in the room. They failed to check out on time, and so she managed to escape. At this point, she ran into a nearby room. She shut the door. She started to scream. She was saying, he's going to kill me, he's going to kill me. The police are called. It's very quick that they identify that it's David Sumny Jr. And at this point, they obtain a warrant for David Jr.'s arrest for the attempted murder. However, unbelievably, they never acted upon the warrant, and David was not arrested. I mean, how much more serious can it be aside from murder itself? Attempted murder is one of the most heinous crimes. They have a warrant, and yet he isn't actually arrested. And also, the authorities failed to log the warrant into the National Crime Information Centre, because if they'd done that, that would have alerted out-of-state police to arrest him. Can somebody please explain how this happens to me? Please. Answers on a postcard to me house, please, because I don't get it. So let's just go through that. So you're in the office, you know, somebody walks in and you're like, had a good day? Well, you're not going to believe it. You are not going to believe what I've just had to deal with. What have you had to deal with? I've just had to deal with this young woman. She's been waterboarded, properly waterboarded, 3 days, basically held hostage, beaten up, been threatened with her life. Finally, bellhop comes and she escapes. But basically the boyfriend banged 2 rights, dead 2 rights. This guy needs to be arrested for absolute attempted murder every day of the week. Yeah, he does. So have you done that? No, not yet. I've got a warrant out for his arrest. Oh, good. We need to get him soon, because people like that are very, very, very dangerous. They are very, he's actually got previous. That's how dangerous he is. Very, 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 very dangerous. Right. So what's next? Nothing. What? Doing nothing. Wouldn't it be a really good idea to use the tippy-tappy and just pop in the details, you know, to the national computer so that the whole of the country can be on alert for this fugitive? Yeah, that'd be great, but I'm not going to do it. Why? I have no idea. I have no idea. I'm just going to let it go over my head and hope for the best. So if he comes back into this state, though, if he's in this one tippy toe into this state, I will have him. This doesn't sound like it's going to end well. No, it never does. Anyway, I kid you not. I kid you not. And the thing is, the reason it baffles me and the reason it's distressing is when these massive failures take place, it costs lives. And also, when you are a predator and a perpetrator, even though you don't always operate in consequential values, the chances are, if you are brought in for attempted murder, things are going to get real. Things are going to get real. And he isn't. So he is, as far as he's concerned, got away with attempted murder. The consequences aren't there. And when people don't have consequences, they push boundaries further. So people out of state, authorities out of state, are not looking for him at this moment in time, which is harrowing. Now, once David Jr. returns to Pennsylvania, because of course he wants to go back there, that's where he lives, and he wants to get away from what's just happened, he has another run-in with the police, and at this point he's arrested for attacking a Lyft driver. That's in August 2019. Of course, the outstanding warrant for the hotel incident went unnoticed. This would have been a perfect opportunity to drag this attempted murderer off the streets. But because that stuff has not been inputted, they don't even know he's wanted. So he's now given a summons charging him with simple assault and harassment and a physical strike, because he's obviously engaged in this scenario with the Lyft driver. So as I said, no consequences. Now on September the 1st, which is a Sunday in 2019, Margaret's family gets some really tragic news. Margaret's brother John has sadly passed away, and her family are just trying to get in contact with her. They want to tell her that this has happened, but there's no answer. Now, understandably, that's the first thing you're going to do when somebody that you love has been lost. You're going to contact the nearest and dearest, and they call again, and they call again, and they call again. No answer. So eventually Margaret's daughter, Ellen, is actually called, because they're like, have you seen your mum? And we can't contact your mum. So Ellen straight away calls Margaret. She doesn't get any answer, but then she calls her brother David Jr. David Jr. says, oh, I'm at mum's house, but mum's sleeping. So she says, well, can you go and get mum, because we've got some really important news, and he doesn't want to. So she says, well, will you get her to ring me when she wakes up? But Ellen's already suspicious. She doesn't think that her mother would ever be asleep in the day. It's just not what she does unless she's unwell, and he isn't indicating that she's unwell. Hours pass, there's no call off Margaret, so Ellen's really concerned now. She rings back. She speaks to David, and she says, listen, If she's still sleeping, as he suggests she is, maybe she needs to go to the hospital, but at this point, David just hangs up. So Ellen knows something is wrong. On the 2nd of September 2019, at this point, police respond to Margaret Sumny's house in South Fayette, Pennsylvania, because they want to do a welfare check. Her daughter Peggy's called it in. They're really worried about what's happened to their mum. Peggy basically calls the police, says, I need a wellness check, and says my brother David Jr. is staying in the house and he's got a history of elder abuse. So understandably, they have reasonable grounds to go and check on her. And oh my God, the sight that they are met with is beyond harrowing. So inside Margaret's home, they make this discovery of what can only be described as a horrific scene. Police find the now dead body of 67-year-old Margaret. She's in the bathtub. It was obvious to them the moment that they saw her that she was already dead. And one of the really disturbing features was that there was literally blood splatter throughout the house. This is including on the ceiling. So just contextualize that for a moment. When somebody has blood splatter on the ceiling, it's because the way they met their death was absolutely harrowing. You're talking about blunt force trauma, beatings that are so violent that the blood splatter literally just dissipates across the room and sprays that way, getting smaller and smaller. But we're talking about it going the distance because it was so violent, the attack itself. Police who attended that scene said it was unlike anything they'd ever seen before. And again, that invites us to the scene. That invites us to the gravity of what's played out, because these are hard-died police officers. They know what it's like to see people who are dead. They know what it's like to witness brutality firsthand. And they're saying they've never seen anything as horrific as this before. When they remove Margaret's body, they take her to the medical examiner's office. They do an autopsy. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head and neck. And I think that goes without saying when we talk about the impact of the blood splatter regarding those first responders who saw it. It's obvious that that's how it's played out. Margaret had also suffered really severe fractured ribs, a spinal fracture. She had lacerations covering her body, including cuts on her face and scalp. And Margaret's injuries were likened by the medical examiner to that of a fatal car crash. So the manner of death was ruled a homicide. Goes without saying that would be the case. But now they're dealing with the reality that they have a perpetrator on the loose. So Ellen, at this point, calls David Jr. to say, Mum's been found dead. She calls him. He picks up the phone, so he does answer it. She said the first words out of his mouth were that he couldn't go through another death after losing his dad. So David Jr. was basically saying he already knew that his mum was dead. So Ellen knew at that moment in time he was the responsible party. It was as simple as that. He tripped himself up. Police then have to gather all the evidence. They go through the home looking for evidence. There were towels with blood on them. There was blood in the carpet on the landing. There was more blood in the house than some officers had apparently ever seen in a crime scene. They also found a handsaw that was recovered just outside the bathroom. So this led the police to believe that David Jr. had had some intent on dismembering her body to dispose of it. There was also an empty ammunition box found in the house. Margaret's revolver, however, was not found in the house, which could mean that whoever had carried out the killing had actually taken the revolver from the home. Ellen then tells the police, look, I've spoken to David Jr. I know that he was at the house with Mum the day before her body was found because I spoke to him. At this point, David Jr. is immediately considered the main suspect, and they think that he probably has Margaret's gun. They then put out a bolo, which means be on the lookout, and this is sent to local law enforcement saying that David was wanted, and he was wanted in relation to being questioned for the death of his mother. He was possibly armed and he was possibly dangerous, but the police can't find him. Ellen at this point steps in and says, I can help you. So she says she's going to call David, she's going to speak to David Jr., she's going to keep the conversations limited. And during one of these conversations, Ellen actually suggests to David Jr., look, you need to go to our uncle's funeral. At this point, investigators stake out the funeral, and he actually attends. He goes to that funeral. And I guess he was in a rock and a hard place situation there, wasn't he? So on one level, people could be like, well, he's out of his mind going. He's on the run with this murder. Equally, if he doesn't go to that particular funeral, he's going to look like he's absolutely guilty. That's going to be evidence for the prosecution, isn't it? He didn't even attend the funeral of his much-loved uncle, meaning that he was guilty of the murder of his mother. So he probably goes thinking, well, why would a guilty person do this? I'm going to look innocent. And so that's the motivation for him attending. Obviously, the minute that he leaves the funeral, David Jr. is arrested. Now, when he gets to the station, they search him. They find a gold necklace, a silver bracelet, and 3 blank checks, all belonging to his mother. They then detain him on those grounds, so for theft by unlawful taking, because they don't belong to him. They also find a key card for a local hotel. At this point, they execute a search warrant on that hotel room. And in that hotel room, there's a plethora of Margaret's items. So they've got designer handbags there, Margaret's gun, various pieces of jewellery, her bank cards, her credit cards, and also Margaret's expired passport. So he's thought about how to sustain himself financially by taking these things. And they discovered that when David Jr. booked the hotel room, he actually gave the hotel manager a set of pearls and remarked, from a special lady to a special lady. Genuinely, if somebody did that when I was working, I'd immediately ring the police. Is it just me? Have I got to this point where I'm so suspicious? But honestly, if I was working anywhere, doesn't matter if it's a hotel, doesn't matter whether I'm on a reception desk somewhere, doesn't matter if I'm in my office, if somebody walked in and was like, hey, I don't know you, I'm gonna give you this set of pearls, very modern, and I'm gonna say, from a special lady to a special lady. I'd be like, first of all, this guy wasn't presenting as a lady, so he's not saying it's from him. Secondly, I'm not sure I know anybody in the age range who wears pearls. And thirdly, why is this stranger adorning me with these gifts? He's probably going to kill me. That's where my mind would go. And I'd be like, I need to talk about this strange guy who's just come into my hotel. I think maybe he's done something terrible to someone. He's trying to pan off on me some of the items. But this is clearly what he's trying to do. He's financially trying to be looked after by his mother's items, both her credit cards, her bank cards, but also to be able to sell the designer bags, etc., to get him by. So all of this evidence obviously points towards David Jr. being responsible. At this point, David gets interrogated by the detectives, and when he's questioned about his mother's death, he doesn't confess. He just seems to think that he's brighter than the detectives are. He refuses to talk to the police. He does call his sister, Ellen, from jail, and he starts crying, and Ellen says to him, you are crying because you're caught. You're not crying because you cared. She's absolutely right. He's crying because he's done. He's lost his freedom. Shit's got real. He's now going to have to face the consequences of his actions. Now, as David refused to speak to detectives, they conducted a forensic search of his cell phone. And what they turned up is harrowing beyond belief. This showed how David Jr. had documented, and I mean documented, his mother's murder. There were 277 pictures from between the 30th of August and the 2nd of September. These ranged from Margaret sitting on a couch, just holding this bloody rag on her head. I mean, just put yourself into that context in this moment. We are dealing with a woman whose son has obviously violently assaulted her. She's bleeding, she's got a rag on her head, and he's taking pictures of her. Then there's pictures of her lying on the floor in this bloody state. He put her in a bed, he moved her around, he had her pose in different ways there. There was a selfie of him with blood splatter all over his face. There was images of him flashing a thumbs up. There was a video of him literally washing his mother's mangled corpse in the bathtub. He also had searches that he'd done on his computer and on his phone on how to clean up a crime scene, also about how long it takes for a body to start decomposing and smelling. So this is all saying that he wanted to get away with his mother's murder. He wanted to essentially dispose of a body and prevent himself being apprehended for this crime. We're not talking about somebody who's had a momentary break from reality. We're talking somebody who's been involved in protracted torture of this absolutely lovely woman, this loving mother, this person described as pure love by the people who know her. And he's taken time to absolutely decimate her. Obviously, this introduces the prosecutors to an automatic reality that this man is guilty. He's charged with 6 counts of theft by unlawful taking, 1 count of robbery, 1 count of abuse of a corpse, and 1 count of criminal homicide. David's then taken to a psychiatric hospital, and the doctors there actually declare him criminally sane to stand trial. The photos that David had taken really helped investigators come up with a theory about what happened to Margaret on the 30th of August. So it's believed that he basically started to torture her because she rejected his demands for more money, much as he'd done the same to his father when he said no to him. He probably felt angry that she didn't have the means that he was used to as well, because she'd financially struggled after the divorce. So he probably resented her for not being able to provide him with a lifestyle that he wished to experience. So now he's really angry. He's got permission based. She's failing him. So then he beats Margaret with his bare hands in this brutal assault. And he's huge compared to Margaret. So it's not going to be hard for him to bring grievous harm to her very quickly. We get to August 2022. At this point, David does actually manage to strike a plea deal. So he pleads guilty to 3rd-degree homicide, and the other charges were actually dismissed. So at trial, a doctor actually testified that David Jr. may have been in an improper mental state during the attack. This was apparently down to high doses of Adderall in his bloodstream at the time of the attack. And in court, I will say that David Jr. did apologise for his actions. He said, "I cannot believe I would let myself get into such a state where I could do something so bad, so horrible. I cannot believe what I did, that I killed my own mother. To my family, to my sisters, to my aunts, I know it's impossible to forgive me. I don't forgive myself. I just want to let them know I'm truly sorry." At this point, he was sentenced to a minimum of 20 years to a maximum of 40 years, and he'd already served 3 years at this time. I don't know how you guys feel about that sentencing, but I imagine that most of us would have thought about murder in the 1st degree when we consider the fact that there was a protracted torture period. Just throwing it out there. I appreciate I'm not legally qualified, but sometimes I think that the decisions I make a lot more sense than the decisions that the courts make. Okay, not the ones where I suggest hitting people with wet fish in court or sending them down to hell in a elevator immediately. I appreciate that's probably not going to happen in my lifetime, but I do hold hope for the future that these things may be brought in. I'm saying that when I'm being logical, commonsensical, and experience-based, I don't think that murder in the 3rd degree is sufficient for what I've just described. And understandably, Margaret's family are desperate to have this plea deal taken off the table. They want him tried for murder in the 1st degree. But in spite of this, on the 5th floor of Allenby County Court, Judge Edward Bukowski certified an August plea for David Jr. Sumny, who was given the 3rd-degree murder charge for the savage 2019 slaying of his mother. During this really brief hearing, 6 of David Jr.'s family members sat in a row as Bukowski explained how he was not going to grant their wish to reject the plea. He said, "Sometimes cases are resolved on a regular basis against the wish of family members, and sometimes even victims." That just feels like cold justice, and I appreciate the law can be quite cold, but I think it's devastating for the family. And as Bukowski gave his ruling, several of Margaret's family members just began shaking their heads. They were absolutely blown away that they'd lost their battle for a full-scale prosecution, because the original charges did include 1st-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, theft, and robbery, which are obviously going to create a much longer sentence. And Anne Shade, so one of Margaret's 3 sisters who was in attendance there, said, "This is just so wrong. I just can't believe this. Nobody is listening to us." And several seats down in that courtroom, David Jr. Sumner's ex-girlfriend, who was at the centre of a separate Atlantic City criminal case where he was accused of what I talked about earlier, where she was waterboarded, where she was strangled in a hotel room in July 2019, she just shook her head violently because, again, he's just getting away with things he shouldn't get away with. She said, "A ton of bricks just went on my shoulders. I almost puked when he said he was keeping the plea." I get that completely. I really do. I can't quite wrap my head around why he was allowed to get away with pleading for 3rd degree. It feels certainly first degree in my mind. And apparently the family don't ever want David to be released. They feel that David Jr. is somebody that would hunt them down when he gets out. Margaret's daughter and David's sister, Ellen, said, this is definitely not justice for my mum, and it's definitely not keeping society safe. I don't understand how Pennsylvania doesn't see him as a dangerous enough to warrant a conviction of first-degree murder. To ever let him out, I don't have words for it. I don't think you'd fix David. Somebody who takes pictures, selfies, as they murder someone, he's a killer. That's all he is, and I believe he would definitely kill again. And I have to say, I am totally on the board with Ellen in this moment. I think she's absolutely right. This is a guy with outrageous behavior who's been violent throughout, who almost killed his father, has killed his mother, almost killed an ex-girlfriend. Why are we playing with this idea that this man is ever going to be safe to walk the streets? Nonetheless, this is where we're at. David Sumny Jr. is currently serving his sentence at the State Correctional Institution, and we hope that he will always be there. Let's hope that when it comes down to potential parole, he's never considered safe. It blows my mind that somebody with this kind of MO, this kind of history, this kind of escalating, graduating behavior is potentially going to walk the streets again. And this is why when you have individuals with the kind of nature going to prison, we see repeat offences, because they don't change their ways. They don't take accountability, they don't take responsibility, they just re-offend at a bigger level. That's what happened where David Sumny Jr. is concerned, and Ellen and her family are correct in calling out this bullshit. He is a danger to anyone. Mother, father, sister, friend, girlfriend, anybody that he feels he can exploit, who fails to give him what he wants, could end up in this situation. Now, I appreciate that it's likely the prosecution believed that the reason they would agree that deal was if it went to court on a murder in the first degree, and shall we say a level of mental instability was brought in. Therefore, there was a suggestion that he wasn't necessarily compos mentis at the crime. It could destabilise that guilty verdict. But I don't think it would have. I mean, show a jury a series of photographs of a beloved, beautiful, compassionate mother who was guilty only of nurture. Show them pictures of her being destroyed. Show them selfies of the killer enjoying the experience. Show them the evidence that he was intending to flee. Show them all of that and let them make the decision. Because David Sumny Jr. doesn't sound out of his mind. He sounds like a psychopathic narcissist of the highest order. And of course, there could be some mental fragility there as well. People who are psychopathic killers can also sometimes become mentally ill, but that is not the issue here. The issue here is that David Sumny Jr., pretty much from the get-go, was a psychopath. He was a psychopath with the privilege, with the love, with the opportunity, with the possibilities that very few of us are afforded. And he chose, in spite of that, to still do everything in his power to destroy. Genuinely believe people like him are born that way. I'd love to know your thoughts. I mean, Margaret Sumny, what was she guilty of? She was guilty of love. She was guilty of care. She deserved so much better, as did David Sr. But time and time again, we see it, don't we? People don't take it seriously when people that they love harm them because they just want to believe that they're better. They just want to believe it's out of character. And that's why we see domestic homicides regularly playing out. If you're in a situation that feels a little bit like this, if you have a child doing these kind of things to you, listen. Let Margaret Sumny be evidence of what happens when you fail to take these situations seriously and realise you matter. No one has the right to lay hands on you. No one. For no reason at any point. Let me know your thoughts, guys. As ever, I'll see you again next time and take care.